Welcome. Thanks for sticking with us through to this, one of the final sessions here at the Battle of Ideas Festival. This session, Kamalamania, Trump, and the Vibes election. I'm delighted to be chairing this session, really important issue that I'm sure many of us are following closely. I'm Jacob Reynolds. I'm the head of policy for MCC Brussels, as well as an associate fellow at the Academy of Ideas. I want to do something slightly different with this session. If you've been here at the weekend, we're late, it's kind of maybe people are lagging slightly, but I want to turn this into a little bit more of a conversation about the election, not least because, well, we wrote this session out and we're thinking about it when Kamala Harris had just been kind of foisted to the forefront and made, by committee meeting, effectively the Democratic nominee. And so at the time, it seemed that you could conjure into existence a kind of fake enthusiasm for a candidate that was called Kamalamania. And if you guys have been following things as they've been developing over the last few weeks, then I mean, the session already, while the title slightly feels outdated, because things have changed quite a lot. So I want to dig into kind of where we're at now, what's happened to the issues that are supposed to characterize this election, and kind of this sense that the American political system is becoming so dysfunctional that it's almost impossible to manage the kind of big fractious country that is the United States of America. To guide us through, I'll just introduce our panelists very, very quickly. So from left to right, starting with Nick Dixon, who's a comedian, a presenter at GB News, and the host of the show The Current Thing. Sitting next to me on my left is Stan Swim, who's the chief program officer of the Bill of Rights Institute and our token American on the panel. And then on my right here is Dr. Richard Johnson, who's a writer and a senior lecturer in politics at Queen Mary University, London. And then furthest over there is Dr. Cheryl Hudson, who's a lecturer in US political history at the University of Liverpool and the author of Citizenship in Chicago, Race, Culture, and the Remaking of American Identity. Now, I mean, Nick, I alluded to this in the introduction. We said Kamalamania, but is that already a thing of the past? Has she kind of fallen flat? What's happened from that supposedly kind of triumphant anointing of Queen Kamala? What's gone wrong?
Okay, great question. Can I just quickly say, I thought we were going to start with like a 5-minute set. I had this whole stand-up thing planned. It was going to be so funny.
It was going to be that funny.
Just imagine how funny that was going to be. You'll never hear that. Because our esteemed chair said no formal speeches. I was like, yeah, I'm not going to do a formal speech, but of course I'm going to do a 5-minute statement. But apparently it's all just questions. It's just kind of a loose hippie vibe. So let me try and just a couple of quick caveats at the top. This is called the Vibes election. I didn't realize I'm on with like serious political professors. My background is stand-up comedy. So can I just quickly say, I think I'm the Vibes panelist here. So you'll only get vibes from me. Thank you. We got some Vibes fans. And so I am the Vibes. And I also want to quickly say, it's always a little bit obnoxious to comment on another country and give political prescriptions. I don't really like it when people do it to my country. I think there's a slight exception here, though, because we did invent America. So I'm going to allow it. Shots fired. And I am sat on the far left, but that's the only far left thing you'll get from me today. You can tell from my choice of drink which team I'm on. What would Donald do is what I always ask. Anyway, I'll answer your question now. I've done enough banter. So Kamalamania was very short-lived because it was entirely based on nothing, wasn't it? It was just like, oh no, we've got this candidate that probably even Obama didn't want. He's like, there's going to be a fair and free process, and everyone's like, no, we're just going with Kamala. Oh, okay. So even Barack was shot, and they just plonked in Kamala. No one wanted her. So the media was like, oh no, we've got to make this candidate who's notoriously awful, no one votes for, no one likes, has no opinions, no thought. We're going to have to make her something. And they go, oh, she's brat. And you're like, okay, I mean, brat's a noun, that doesn't even make sense, but all right, I mean, but I understand it's come from some culture thing. So she's brat. And they're like, yeah, Kamala, she's new. You thought you knew the old Kamala. This is the new Kamala. She's the same person, but now we're desperate. So to me, Kamalamania was always just a puff of smoke and was always going to evaporate as soon as she had to do any actual interviews. And I think that's what we've seen.
Yeah, great. And Cheryl, I mean, one of the things that we did focus on a little bit in the blurb and in the session is the sense that maybe uniquely among American elections, the kind of complete absence of anything resembling substance and issues. And so we reflected on this as kind of calling it the Vibes election. What have you made? What's really missing from the debate around the election?
I'm much less funny. So in August, when I was invited to come on the panel, and I was told it was about Kamalamania, I said, by October, there will be no Kamalamania. Like, it was obvious to me that it was a very short-lived thing. Basically, it came out of the fact that everybody understood that Joe Biden couldn't be the candidate. He was going to lose. Nobody else in the Democratic Party wanted that poison chalice. She was the only possible candidate that they could put up. And so when she was put forward and replaced Biden, there was just such a massive sense of relief that Biden was not going to be the candidate, So there was a bounce in the polls, and she went crazy over social media and everything. But the thing about vibes, and everyone was talking about brat summer, we had the brat summer. Vibes are a sign that politics is empty, that it's hollowed out, that there is a real disconnect between voters and the political class that are supposed to represent them. Vibes kind of fill that vacuum in a sense. But I think it's really important to kind of get into what those vibes are. What vibes are the candidates putting out? They do mean something. There is something important about the vibes that they think that the voters need to feel. That sort of emotional comfort that they're getting from their candidates, Daddy Trump and Mamala.
The other side of things then, Stan, Trump. Like, it seemed to me, especially in the early stages of the campaign, maybe Trump was kind of going on these random podcasts, and it didn't seem like we had the old Trump, that he wasn't necessarily firing on all cylinders. Has something changed there, or where do things stand with Trump?
Well, I don't know, but as the panel's token American, as I walked out of Victoria Station earlier today past one of the theaters, I thought I could hear somebody singing, "You'll be back." I don't know. I think there was pretty clear momentum for Trump when he thought his opponent was Joe Biden. He was sharper than Biden seemed to be. But he's never been a massively popular fella, and neither has Kamala, for that matter. And so I think we're going to a situation where at least I find myself struggling to get excited about either choice, and I think there's a healthy chunk of the country that's in the same boat. You start with a Kamalamania, but if you look at kind of the barometers that we might use in the States, a Real Clear Politics poll for the average there, for example, this race looks pretty dead even to me. And so I'm not sure that the momentum that either side may see extends much beyond their own base.
Yeah, and Richard, reflecting a bit on I touched on it in the opening, the sense that America has just almost become too unwieldy. The political system is kind of, I don't know whether it's captured just by the old parties and they're kind of responsive, but like, what do you make of this sense that the system itself seems to be stuck in a bit of paralysis, not just by the fact that the candidates were or are a little bit old, but this whole sense the system's kind of unresponsive now?
What we've seen in the United States is what we call a massive ideological sorting. So the political parties used to be quite ideologically heterogeneous. So you'd have conservative Democrats and you'd have liberal Republicans, and the parties were, in American terms, big tent, we call it broad church. The parties now are much more ideologically coherent and consistent. People on the right of politics vote Republican, people on the left of politics vote Democrat. Now, from a outside US perspective, that isn't too surprising. That's the way that politics works in many other countries. But in the United States system, this causes problems because of the high level of what we call in political science veto players, the checks in the system, the need to get through the House, the Senate, president, and so on. Add to that a country that's very evenly divided. I think since the year 2000, no Democrat or Republican presidential candidate has received less than 45% of the vote, and none has received more than 52% of the vote. And in this election, we can expect the candidates to fall within that range as well. And so there's a winner-take-all mentality in the parties, but there isn't a winner-take-all system to deliver the policies that those parties are standing for. And what that just tends to mean is you get stuck with gridlock.
Yeah, great. And Nick, coming back to you, I mean, when Trump was shot, and then he stood up and he raised his fist, and there was this kind of triumphant moment, and it was the American flag was in the background, and you thought for a moment, right, this is the moment. This is the kind of key point in the election that's going to swing it, and that Trump after this is going to be able to make huge amount out of this kind of key moment. And then, I mean, to me, and even lots of my friends are really sympathetic to Trump, you kind of felt he came up with, he didn't have much to say on it. He couldn't kind of transform that moment into something else. But what was your take on that?
Okay, yeah. Well, one of the questions in the blurb was, is this election, how important is it? And I'm like, well, it's quite important because they keep trying to kill one of the candidates. So that implies to me someone cares. Enough to be shot in the head, and which is what happens when you try and kill the president. So, yeah, but you're absolutely right. There was a moment where it's like, right, Trump's won it because he said fight, fight, fight. But our news cycle is so absurd that about a week later it was like, well, that's done. And he tried to sort of bring it up in the debate, I think, and it was just sort of moved on from very quickly by the entirely neutral moderator. And so, yeah, it was incredible how quick that moment moved on. Though it's still in people's minds, I think, and we don't know how Kamala would have reacted, but we can imagine it wouldn't have been the same, and obviously Biden wouldn't have done the same. So I think it is still significant, not as significant as it should have been, but I also think that Trump's already basically won. He's playing music, he's chilling out, he's got a playlist. I feel like the vibe is that he's already basically won it, unless they default to what I call the rig or kill strategy, which. They can always rig or kill, and the thing is, I don't think they will rig it this time because it's much harder to rig it when you've got the world's richest man ready to sue you, which Elon Musk would presumably do. You've got Silicon Valley. Obviously, they didn't rig it last time either. It's all banter, this. And I'm not saying they're directly responsible for the shootings either and the assassination attempts, but there is this stochastic terrorism that the left has given us, so they're responsible in one way or another. So they could always default to that, but I basically think Trump's won it if it's a fair election.
Yeah, and Cheryl, I think like the last couple of times Trump ran, and the first time he won, there was obviously, I think a lot of people identified this as a real populist moment in American politics. It probably was. I understand or think that maybe something's changed a little bit with Trump. Some people are writing that he's kind of lost his populist touch. There's no longer the kind of Steve Bannon machine kind of behind him. What do you make of that? Is Trump even still a populist? Was he ever?
I think he was a populist, and 2016 really ripped up the rules. It changed the game, and I don't think that it's recovered since then. So I think he's moved the discussion on so that a lot of the Democratic response to him, I mean, he's kind of taken over the Republican Party. Nobody can oppose him from within it. But the Democrats try to play him at his own game now. So they are taking on his policies. They're trying to, this whole vibes thing comes from him, right? So it's so you associate it with Kamalamania, but actually Donald Trump also embraces those vibes, and I do think it's worth getting into what these vibes mean, what they represent in American political life, because and what vibes are attached to each of the candidates. So with Kamala, I mean, I was thinking about this. It's like, right, what are her vibes? Apart from the wine mum or whatever. Like, she represents vibes are emotions, right? They want to encourage an emotional attachment from voters rather than one based on politics or political interest or kind of rational thought about solutions for political problems. We just want a kind of a shallower emotional attachment. Kamala's vibe is joy, right? This is what she kind of put out there, is joy. This is what we want, but also fear, right? So they've both got flip sides of their vibe. So the fear is Russia. The fear is fascism, coming from Trump, the dictator. And on Trump's side, the vibes are hate. On the negative side, there's hate. So there's hate towards the immigrants. There's hate towards China, but then also fun. Right, so his kind of more positive equivalent is fun rather than joy. So what's the difference between joy and fear? I mean, there's been lots of talk about the negative stuff, the fear and the hate, but the joy and the fun are really interesting to me in a way of like positively motivating voters to identify with the candidates. Are they trying to manipulate the emotions? Are they trying to fill this kind of vacuum of meaning that exists? And I think that joy means it kind of represents a lasting contentment. It's more permanent, right, than fun. So fun is this fleeting experience of pleasure. And my best example of that is when Trump went back to the place where he experienced the assassination attempt. and he was giving another talk, another rally in the same spot. He opens his talk with, as I was saying, right? So it's like, when you, this is the way that he combats the fear narrative, because when you're having fun, you don't feel fear, right?
Okay.
So that's...
Yeah, no, good. We'll come back to this. Stan, pick up on these things if you like, but I know you're also interested in the kind of a more granular perspective and the distinction between the coverage, at least in the UK, is often kind of very national versus actually what's going on in the individual states. But pick up on this if you like.
Yeah, I mean, there has been a nationalization that at least from my view, started with the 1994 election when Newt Gingrich and the Republicans successfully nationalized a whole bunch of issues to win the House. And that was a real earthquake in American politics. I think we can argue over what degree this might be the case, but it seemed to me that shifted a lot of the media oxygen to the national landscape. But that isn't the only place where American governance occurs. America is a nation of 50 states, and those states each have very robust systems by design. 45% of the total spending on government that occurs in the state occurs in state and municipal governments. And there's a lot more robust conversation happening among governors and legislatures. You see more heterodox solutions to things. And so in that way, the national presidential election gets a bit cartoonish for me compared to what's going on at a substantive level in many of these other states. So you have a state like Vermont, which can elect Bernie Sanders as a senator and has a Republican governor who is the most popular governor in the country within his own state. I could give more examples like that, but I think there's a lot going on under the surface that is different from the hyperbolic picture that you see at the top between the two presidential candidates.
Richard, does this link back to your kind of point about the ungovernability or the difficulty in kind of governing America? I mean, one suggestion would be kind of return some of the power to the states, but what's your take on this?
Well, I would agree that we don't pay enough attention to the states. When I teach US politics, one of the things I do try to do with our students is take them outside of Washington, D.C., at least in conceptual terms, and to think about different controversies that are happening in the states on just even, say, the point of we'd look at the 51 constitutions of the United States, not just one, because each state has their own constitution. But on the ungovernability point at the federal level, I mean, it is worth saying that with this kind of ideological sorting, what it does mean is that if you do have your ducks all in a row, if you do have unified control of Congress, you are able to get more through in a consistent kind of ideological policy line than you once were. You don't have to compromise as much if you do control the House, the Senate, and the White House, and have a way to evade the filibuster in the Senate, which there are certain ways to do so. And in this respect, I would argue that what we've seen really is the tragedy of the Joe Biden election is that in policy terms, he was the most legislatively successful Democratic president since Lyndon Johnson. He invested more in the US economy than any president since Franklin Roosevelt. Depends how you measure it, but if you just take Biden's four biggest spending bills, the American Rescue Plan, the Infrastructure Act, the Chips and Science Act, and the Inflation Reduction Act, if you just take those four, that came to $800 billion. That came to $4.2 trillion. Now, the New Deal in inflation-adjusted terms was $800 billion. So in just 2 years, Joe Biden was able, in inflation-adjusted terms, to far outspend what the Franklin Roosevelt spent in the New Deal throughout the 1930s. And even if you calculate it in terms of percent of GDP, which some economists say is a better way of doing it, Biden's spending was about half in the first 2 years of his presidency was about half of Franklin Roosevelt's throughout the 1930s and social programs. Now, people, maybe many in the room, would disagree with that, but actually from a perspective of kind of old-fashioned left-wing material politics, Biden was very successful in that regard. But he's been a disaster at selling that because Donald Trump has been very successful in shaping the culture. And I was struck when I was in the US for a couple of months earlier the year when Biden was still the nominee, that all of the attention was on Donald Trump. Biden was like a sideshow, even though he's the president of the United States, and people were just interested in Donald Trump. And Biden has just been, partly because of his age, for other reasons, I think he's had bad political advice. He's just been unable to sell a coherent and compelling narrative about his presidency, and I think that has been a tragedy for him, even if whether or not you agree with that.
Great. Okay, one last question to all of the panel, and then we'll come out. But try and nail it. What's at stake in this election, and as a result, who's going to or who should win?
What's at stake?
Yeah.
Well, I think it's a massive election in terms of what's at stake. Although I tend to think even if Trump wins, it's just a slowing down of decline, but it's still a massive difference. I mean, if you talk about war, Trump always likes to boast those wars wouldn't have happened with him. I tend to believe him. Then if you look at censorship, Hillary Clinton's talking about bringing in Section 230. They're obsessed with censoring Twitter. You could talk about the economy. You could talk about the Constitution. John Kerry wants to change the First Amendment and things like this. So I think there's a big question of how far is Trump really something different? Is he a real, if you go to like things like elite theory, is he a real counter-elite? You've now got, you've got Musk on board, you've got RFK Jr. on board, so it's kind of an interesting potential counter-elite, and you've got Vance, who is a potentially more radical figure if they sort of listen to him. So the question of how different will Trump actually be, I think probably it'll be an attempt to return to a kind of 90s liberalism. You'll have high-skilled immigration, which Musk is really into. You'll have free speech and all that sort of thing. So it probably won't be that radical, but it's still a massive improvement on what it will be with Kamala Harris, which will just be a complete disaster in all regards.
Yeah, Stan.
So I'm on the fence.
What's the stake?
Yeah, he sounds on the fence to me. For me, this comes down to whether or not our political leadership is actually willing to listen to more than their most ardent cheerleaders. And in a nation that wants to somehow be unified, that's 330 or so million people. I mean, what is it, 7 or 8 times the population of Britain? It is ungovernable in certain ways, and I don't know if it was meant to be governed in a really thick way, but you can't have the kind of disconnect that I think exists between parties and the country for all that long without needing to have some sort of really significant bruising of those parties. I don't, and so to me, whichever party ends up on the short stick on election night, I wonder what kind of conversation they will have internally and whether it will allow them to break some of this logjam by re-engaging with a wider part of the political electorate. That sort of compromise in our system doesn't occur by building parliamentary coalitions. It's supposed to occur in the broad church or the big tent sort of sense, where the parties are supposed to be the mechanism for that. They're not doing a great job of it right now. I think at the margins, the Trump coalition might be open to a little more heterodoxy, it seems to me, and so maybe there's something happening there, but I don't think you can look at it and say that they're listening to the other side in a particularly attentive way. And so you're going to see really significant disappointment no matter which way this thing goes. And to me, the real question is, will the losing party learn anything, and how much will that delay the learning on the part of the winner?
Great, nice point. Richard, what's at stake?
Well, I think in legislative terms, we shouldn't expect a great deal from either president, because it's quite likely that there will be divided government, that the Senate is likely to go in Republican hands, and I think there's a good possibility that the Democrats could win the House. I mean, there's a greater chance that there'll be unified Republican control, and so Trump might have a bit of leeway to pursue a certain legislative agenda. But I have to say that when he was president the first time and he had unified control of Congress for the first 2 years, he had a very light legislative agenda. He preferred to do things through the executive branch, which are quicker and require less compromise, but are less durable and less far-reaching than legislation. I expect probably what we'll see is a fight over the tax cuts and the continuation of the tax cuts. But really, I think the most potentially significant political battle of the next president's term will be who replaces Clarence Thomas on the Supreme Court. Okay, Clarence Thomas has been a member of the Supreme Court since 1991. He's still younger than both Biden and Trump. He's
not saying much.
It's not saying much, but he's 76. But if Trump wins, it's very likely that Clarence Thomas will retire, and his fight will be to get through a nominee through the Senate, which could be very closely divided. Even if it's a Republican Senate, he might have a couple of recalcitrant Republicans like Lisa Murkowski and Susan Collins, who might not like a more radical choice. And you have to remember, Thomas is probably the most conservative member of the court. And so Trump needs to be able to replace him in his kind of political project terms with someone who's equally conservative. And that may be a challenge. If Harris wins, I think Thomas will stay on the court, but a bit like in the case of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, as they start to get a bit older, then questions emerge as to whether they leave the court in involuntary ways.
Yeah, great. Cheryl?
What's at stake, I think, really is the legitimacy of political leadership and really of the American political system. Interesting fact is that if Trump wins, Kamala Harris is going to have to verify the election results, right? So that would be really interesting after the January 6th thing, and to see how the Democrats would handle the loss, because, you know, despite all of the rhetoric, Hillary Clinton did a lot of work in delegitimizing Trump when he beat her to the presidency. So, you know, the question of democracy circulates the whether the president is accepted by half of the country, the other half, you know, the losing half. The issues that are at stake are the economy. Despite all the money that Biden has spent, Americans are not feeling the benefit of it, which, you know, debatable whether they did in the New Deal, but there was a kind of sense of there were social programs for the people. I don't think the American people are feeling the impact of all of the money that's been spent by the Democrats. And in fact, they see the Inflation Reduction Act as actually increasing inflation a lot of them. So there's three issues. One is the economy. Two is immigration, which is, you know, obviously we have a similar issue here in the UK and in Europe. Difficult question. And then abortion is another issue. And I think, you know, the economy and immigration fall for Trump. The abortion issue, I think, falls for Kamala. The problem is that on all of those things in different ways, neither of the candidates really have any solutions. You know, this is why they're falling back on vibes. And however, you know, interesting this discussion about emotions are, you really need to have some kind of rational approach to the political issues that confront the country. My preference, I guess, if you're asking us, is would be for Trump to take the presidency, because he at least recognizes that there is a problem. Right? Make America great again means that, you know, at the moment it's going on the wrong track and it needs to change course.